I had this idea. Nancy Miller, who has edited something like 25 of my books, um, we were talking and she was saying, you should do something on the Upper West Side, like what you did for the Lower East Side. And so that was sort of in my head. And the other thing that was in my head was the weird fact that the oldest known recipe, which it's a Roman recipe from 160 BCE by the Senator Cato, is a recipe for cheesecake. And I thought, isn't that weird? um, there actually is an older recipe that going back thousands of years, the Sumerians gave recipes, but they were in clay tablets. And they were recipes for stews, which is what you'd expect for old recipes, not cheesecake. Um, so I looked at this cheesecake recipe, and it's absolutely incomprehensible. You just can't figure out what's going on there. Forgot to mention some things or something. It just doesn't work at all. And I thought, okay, so I want to write this book about my neighborhood. And I decided it would be fun to really constrict it. This was, around the time of the pandemic where we weren't traveling a lot. I thought, I'm going to write a book about my block. I'm going to write a novel that takes place entirely on 86th Street between Columbus and Amsterdam. And so there's this movement to sort of gentrify and make things upscale. So there was this Greek diner, but it's gone, and the Greek diner in my book is kind of a thing I made up. And in this Greek diner that I made up, this fictionalized Greek diner, they decided to make it an upscale restaurant. And one of the things they decided to do to make it really upscale is they're going to do Cato's cheesecake recipe. So they can't figure it out. They reinvent it. They do all sorts of different things that aren't in the recipe because you can't, if you do the recipe, it's not edible. And the New York Times gives them a great review. Now everybody wants to do Cato's cheesecake, but everybody does it differently because nobody can understand what it's supposed to be. So you have, I think, 5 different Cato's cheesecake recipes. Including there's a bat mitzvah that does it with coating it with chocolate, which of course Cato never heard of chocolate. But if you want to have big success for your bat mitzvah cake, it ought to be chocolate. So it's a story about kind of the gentrification of this block. Told through cheesecake recipes. The thing about this setting also is that the Upper West Side used to be famous for cheesecake. There were many places there famous for cheesecake, Miss Grimble's and the Claire and Grossinger's, all these famous, all out of business now, driven out by rents. I have a book coming out in October from Godine called The Boston Way, which is about a group of Boston abolitionists who believed that the only way to end slavery and get Black people their justice and their rights was to do it nonviolently, that violence wouldn't do it. They said, if you end slavery violently, it'll take 100 years for Black people to get their rights, which turns out to be optimistic. And so this is a book really about the ideas of nonviolence and the importance of nonviolence in political movement, and how violence is not an effective solution. It looked very much like the 1950s civil rights movement. They were nonviolent, freedom riding. There weren't buses, of course, then, but there were trains. They're doing the same thing in trains that the civil rights movement did with buses. Restaurant boycotts, all of the same things. And they even had freedom songs. The songs that the civil rights movement had to motivate their workers, they did the same thing. The this movement was really like a model for the civil rights movement, although I could find very few connections. King never spoke very much about this movement. I would have thought he would have. Um,
How did you first hear about it yourself?
well, that's a funny thing. Um, through food. Uh, Lydia Mariah Child, who was one of the leading abolitionists of this group, wrote a cookbook, which is still in print and is very valued by food historians because it tried to do food for common people, whereas cookbooks were generally for rich people. And so it was an important book in food history. And then I started saying, well, who was this Lydia Mariah Child? And then I got into this whole movement. She was a major figure in the movement. So the movement was an unsung hero. The people within the movement were, I mean, I don't think you would call Frederick Douglass unsung or um, William Lloyd Garrison. A few of the leading people we still remember, but many important people have been, almost completely forgotten. And the anti-war people and the women's rights people. I mean, these all came out of this movement. I mean, the whole suffrage movement, the whole women's movement came out of the abolitionist movement, especially this nonviolent abolitionist movement in Boston. Um, all of the leading figures of, well, not all, but most of the leading figures of the women's movement started off as Boston abolitionists.